Most gardeners are told that compost fixes everything. If soil is dry, add compost. If worms are missing, add compost. If plants struggle, add more compost. I followed that advice for years, and it quietly failed me. My beds still dried out too fast, worms stayed deep or disappeared entirely, and growth plateaued no matter how much finished compost I spread. The problem wasn't effort or quality. The problem was that compost was doing the wrong job. Once I stopped asking compost to hold moisture and started using a moist carbon layer instead, the entire system changed. Water stayed where roots could reach it. Worms moved in fast. Soil stopped collapsing between waterings. Compost finally started working the way it was supposed to. If this kind of practical, field-tested soil work is what you're here for, well, subscribe to Husbandry. This channel is about fixing the real limiting factors in gardens, not just repeating advice that only works on paper. Compost feeds biology, but honestly it is not designed to manage water. Compost is biologically active material. Its primary role is nutrient cycling and microbial inoculation. When gardeners rely on it as a moisture manager, they're asking it to do something it's not built for. Finished compost has already lost much of its carbon structure. It breaks down quickly, collapses under irrigation, and, sheds water once it dries. In my raised beds, a 2-inch compost layer looked rich but behaved like a sponge that dried hard. After a day of heat, water stopped penetrating evenly. Roots clustered shallow, and worms avoided the top layer entirely. Compost was feeding microbes but failing structurally. The soil didn't need more nutrients. It needed a stable, moisture-holding framework. The missing piece was a carbon layer that stays damp without decomposing fast. What really changed everything was adding a dedicated carbon layer below the surface, not as mulch and not as compost. This layer was made from partially decomposed high-carbon material that holds water but resists rapid breakdown. So think shredded leaf mold that's not fully finished, aged wood fibre, coarse cocoa coir, or screened bark fines that have already weathered. I installed it 5 to 8 centimetres below the surface, directly in the root zone, not mixed throughout the bed, not left on top, just a distinct continuous layer. This layer absorbed irrigation, slowed downward water loss, and, stayed cool and damp for days. Compost above it stopped drying out because moisture now had somewhere to rest instead of draining or evaporating. Why worms responded to the carbon layer almost immediately. Worms don't actually chase food the way most gardeners think. What they're really after is moisture, temperature stability, and those subtle microbial gradients in the soil. Compost left on the surface tends to dry out, overheat, and, it just becomes unstable. A moist carbon layer just below the surface, that's what creates the exact conditions worms truly prefer. Within days of adding this layer, worm activity increased dramatically. They tunneled through it, fed along its edges, and dragged organic material into it. Castings began appearing directly above and below the layer, not just deep in the soil. The carbon itself wasn't food in the short term. It was habitat. Compost finally became accessible because the environment around it stopped fluctuating. Many gardeners try to fix dry beds by adding more compost or more mulch. That increases inputs but doesn't address water dynamics. Without an internal moisture buffer, water still drains or evaporates too fast. Roots and worms stay stressed. The carbon layer works because it interrupts that flow. It creates a temporary holding zone for water. Roots can access it slowly, microbes stay active longer. Worms can operate near the surface without desiccation. In practical terms, my watering frequency dropped by half. Beds that needed daily irrigation held moisture for 2 to 3 days, even in warm weather. In a standard raised bed, I pull back the topsoil and compost layer, lay down 3 to 5 centimetres of moist carbon material, and then replace the soil above it. The carbon should be damp when installed, not dry. I water it once during setup to fully charge it. The key is continuity. Gaps defeat the purpose. The layer doesn't need to be thick, but it needs to be unbroken so water spreads laterally instead of dropping straight down. Plants are transplanted as usual. Roots find the layer naturally within a week or two. In larger beds, I apply the same concept in strips or zones rather than the entire bed at once. This reduces labour and lets me compare performance side by side. The difference is always visible. Plants over the carbon layer stay turgid longer. Soil temperature stays lower. Worm counts are higher. For in-ground beds with heavy clay, the layer sits slightly higher to prevent waterlogging. For sandy soils, it sits deeper to slow drainage. Even in systems without soil, moisture buffering matters. In large containers or media beds, a band of high-carbon material like coarse cocoa chips or aged bark placed mid-profile stabilizes moisture and oxygen simultaneously. So, I've tested this in wicking containers and also in media-based hydroponic beds. What's interesting is that root growth really concentrates around the carbon zone, plus the dry-down stress just drops, making things a lot easier for your plants. Nutrient uptake, well, it becomes more consistent because the root environment just stops oscillating all over the place. Now, this isn't about replacing nutrients, it's really about stabilizing the conditions so that nutrients can actually be used by the plants. You know, gardeners are often told to mix everything evenly, mix compost thoroughly, mix amendments deeply. Uniformity feels tidy, but honestly it destroys functional layers. Natural soils are layered for a reason. Water, roots and biology, well, they organize themselves around gradients. By separating roles, compost feeds, carbon buffers and soil support structure, the system becomes more resilient. Mixing everything together creates short-term gains and long-term instability. Once moisture is stable, compost performs better. Microbial activity becomes steady instead of spiking and crashing. Nutrients mineralize at a predictable rate. Worms process compost instead of avoiding it. Or in my beds, I now use less compost overall. It lasts longer, works more efficiently, and doesn't need constant replenishment. The carbon layer carries the structural load compost was never meant to bear. Carbon must be pre-wetted. Dry carbon will steal moisture initially. It must be partially aged, not fresh wood chips. Fresh material ties up nitrogen and creates imbalance. Thickness matters, and too thin and it does nothing. Too thick and roots may stall. 3 to 5 centimeters is enough in most gardens. So this is a tool, not a blanket fix. But you know, when moisture is your limiting factor, it really does solve the right problem. Honestly, the biggest shift here is mental. Soil isn't improved by just adding more inputs. It's improved by, well, assigning those inputs the right jobs. Compost feeds, carbon stabilizers, water connects everything. Once you see that, garden management becomes simpler, cheaper, and far more effective. If this breakdown helped you understand why your soil wasn't responding the way it should, subscribe to Husbandry and share this video with other growers. Practical knowledge only matters if it's passed on and put to work.